Hi, it's another Friday. That means another edition, yet another edition of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. Those of you who've been here before, you know the deal. I'm John, my son Jeremy, my business partner as well, John Zogby Strategies. And here we are, we talk about some news that's hot and give our thoughts about it with a broader perspective, some disagreement, but always civil. How you doing this week?
I'm well, and you?
I'm okay. I got a couple of things on my mind. The first one, I'm going to start local and go global. So, and the whole issue is, does the structure of government really matter? More broadly, do we need an electoral college? Or doesn't it matter that we don't directly elect the President of the United States? And when I say I'm going to start local and move to global, I want to try this story. This is over 40 years ago. I was traveling. I was on a flight, and I sat next to a fellow who was active in politics in Niagara Falls, New York. I told him I was from Utica. Those are two cities about the same size, population. And in Utica, we were debating at that point in time in the early 80s a referendum to limit the power of the mayor. We had what is called in New York State or all local governments a strong mayor type and of government. And there were those in the city council and among the public who thought that the mayor was too powerful, wanted to knock that mayor's power down a few strokes. And this fellow started the conversation, and he said, I asked, how are things in Niagara Falls? He said, well, we have a weak mayor type of government, and we have a ballot referendum where we're going to strengthen the power of the mayor. And he said, once we do that, we'll be able to move forward. And I thought from then and there, I don't think it matters. I don't think it mattered in Utica. I don't think it mattered in Niagara Falls. And bottom line, I taught state and local government at SUNY Poly here in Utica and at Mohawk Valley Community College. And I remember the textbook that began with, it really doesn't matter what the structure of government is. It's all about the people who are in the government. Never forgot that and always tried to hammer that away to my students, which leads then to the more global issue. Founding fathers created an electoral college. You know that they were not little d Democrats. They were among the elite in all of their colonies and states. And many of them, using their own phrase, were worried about mobocracy, or stated simply, about mobs of people with too much democracy electing a demagogue to the presidency. So they put all sorts of limits and checks and balances. And one of those was, instead of the popular vote electing the President of the United States, there'd be a stopgap measure whereby the voters in each state would elect whichever party's candidate won the popular vote. That party's electors would win, or that individual's electors would win. And then the Electoral College would meet a month later, and those individuals would cast their ballots. Okay, that was also a tip to the smaller states, because otherwise back then you get Massachusetts, Virginia, New York, you could probably elect the President of the United States. Just like today, how you wonder how fair can a popular vote be? Candidates would spend all their time where? In New York, California, Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and whatever. 16 out of 50 states could elect a majority. So do we need the Electoral College or not? And I'm thinking about that, especially this is Friday and the day after the 8th public hearing of the January 6th committee. And here was a president who, whether you like him or not, I don't, but here was a president who was going to flout the law and manipulate the Electoral College. And the bottom line is, do we need it anyway? Any thoughts? I mean, does any of this matter?
Well, it matters, and it matters that we understand, because passions do take over. And so in the present moment, I first heard that debate in college right after Bush v. Gore. And I feel like the only other time that I really heard it seriously talked about was when Clinton lost. And I'm not saying like only Democrats cry about it. That's not my point. My point is that sore losers tend to bring up this stuff, and I think we have to understand the principle. And I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking about the checks and balances, because that's key, right? Because I think the founding fathers were right that there is the notion of mobocracy. Athens devolved into mobocracy. Look at what the Roman Republic devolved into. Dictatorships, grandiose dictatorships. I mean, if you're ever interested in seeing what the Roman Empire really was like, read this historical novel called I, Claudius. It's disgusting. It was a bloodbath behind the scenes of assassinations and people just driven mad by power. And, that's what happens when a republic is in decline. And so the founding fathers were looking at it from two angles. They were looking at it from the passions of the voters and the passions of those who seek power, because let's be honest, it's not every time that those who seek government are bad people, but often they're people who want power, oftentimes. But, I'm really reminded of Ben Franklin and what he said, and I think this really sums it up about, the question of a popular vote. Benjamin Franklin famously said that democracy is essentially two wolves and a lamb voting on who gets what for dinner. And so that's why we have the system of checks and balances. That's why we have the Electoral College. It seems elitist, but it also, if you step back and understand the power dynamics on the side of the voters and on the side of those in government, this is something that kind of goes towards the middle in mitigating those passions. But there's a bigger issue. And I talked about it, the notion of sore losers. And we are now at the point, because of 2016 and 2020, where, to kind of tie it back to your point about it matters who's in government, it also matters who the people are voting for, who's in government. And does it really matter if we have a popular vote, or if we have a parliamentary system, or if we have an electoral college system? The fact of the matter is, these two sides hate each other so much, distrust each other so much. Democrats, don't forget about the reactions that you had in 2016. Republicans, don't feel that you have the high moral ground. The two have, I think, absolutely shattered the confidence in the system. And now we're at the point where, Joseph Stalin used to say about elections, it's not the voter that counts, it's the person counting the vote. And that's where we're at, because there's such a conspiracy, there's such a distrust on both sides that, have we crossed the Rubicon in terms of having fair and just elections because of the bubbling surface in the political landscape?
I think we've crossed that line. I agree with you. I think the level of distrust, it's worse than distrust. I mean, it is deep antipathy. Two different planets. We'll talk about secession and that sort of thing at another time. We'll have some polling coming out fairly soon. But I have to tell you, I want to go back, and I want to revisit, if I could, clarify this sore loser concept. Because as you may or may not recall, in 2000, that was very, very close election. The popular vote, of course, was very close. The biggest disputed state happened to be the state where the governor was the brother of the president and elect and former president.
Yeah.
But I was polling for Reuters at the time, and Alan Elsner, brilliant political journalist, after the election, 3 weeks after the election, he said, let's go back in the field. Right before Thanksgiving, the election had not been resolved yet. And he said, let's ask a very basic question. To those who voted for Gore, what if Bush becomes president? Is he legitimate? Legitimate. That's not a word that I had ever heard before. And and then of course we would ask the converse. And so when we asked the Gore voters, 57% of the Gore voters said, if Bush becomes president, he is the legitimate president. I was stunned that 21% said no. I mean, we're not asking, was it fair, or was there a mistake? We're saying legitimate president. But when we asked the Bush voters, 67% of those who voted for Bush said Gore will not be the legitimate president of the United States. Mm-hmm. From that point, it was clear to me that even if the Supreme Court decision had gone in Gore's favor, and there was little chance of that happening, Gore could not be the president of the United States. You can't be president if 2/3 of the other side does not accept your legitimacy. So move then to 2004, and everybody wondered, that was disputed. And Bobby Kennedy, who we've had on this show, wrote a brilliant piece for The Atlantic about Ohio in particular, and some shenanigans with suppressing the vote and so on in Ohio. But within 24 hours, John Kerry conceded the election. I knew exactly what was going on. Kerry must have seen what we saw in 2000, saying, all right, if I happen to win this, now what the hell do I do for the next 4 years? And so bottom line is, we've got a completely broken system. Does the Electoral College matter or not? I think the debate has moved beyond that. Is either side in this temperature, is either side willing to accept the other side, quote, winning an election?
Well, I'm going to agree with you about Democrats in 2000 and 2004, and that my perception is that they were much more better tempered. Mm-hmm. And I think the right had been really riled up throughout the 90s and heated up and the kind of like this country's going to hell in a handbasket because of Clinton, which, stepping aside objectively, Clinton did a lot of bad things. I really think so. I've come to figure that out more. But that right maintained their level of righteous anger, or whatever you want to call it. And but I think the left, since about 2010-11, have really been rising, and since 2016 are on par, if not maybe even exceeding, in terms of their anger. That's what we have. We have voters from both parties in a pressure cooker. But, I got to go back because, I've only voted in 2 elections, and I like to kid about this. I once voted for a bonesman, and I once voted for a bonehead. Can you guess who those are?
Well, I think in my book, they're probably the same person. That would be George W. Bush. He was a bonesman at Yale, right? And a bonehead as president.
Well, no, I did not vote for W.
Okay.
Definitely did not. No, John Kerry.
Bonesman.
And Gary Johnson. Bonehead.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So I've only participated in 2 presidential elections. And I just came to the sense, so let me go back, because I remember believing in college and throughout my 20s, watching the War on Terror, watching the response to 9/11, watching the United States have this sympathy from the world, and then in a month, 2 or 3, gone. George Bush within the country going from a 90% approval rating by the end of his presidency, high 20s, low 30s. The world, like I said, there was sympathy from many places, maybe not necessarily everywhere. And then that gone, living in Europe in 2008 and feeling the hatred from some people, not all people in Europe, about being American. And I was convinced then that had Gore been president, that things would have been better. And I don't think so. I think we still would have had the war on terror. I think the agenda would have moved forward. And sometimes you got to keep it simple. You go
I
back
think you're probably right there. Yeah.
You go back to Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend. We won't get fooled again, because that's my thing. I don't want to get fooled again. And there's that famous line in the song, "Meet the new boss, the same as the old boss." I think there's some truth to that.
Okay. I don't have that illusion about the war on terror. I think that while the advisors in the W. Bush administration were obviously aggressive and were actually looking for a reason to go to war in Iraq, I think that the foreign policy elite on actually both sides, on the Democratic side, the Atlantic Council and Madeleine Albright and would probably led us down that same path. So let's shift gears here a little bit. I have watched the election of 2022 changing its tone, changing its issues. We are both watching moderate voters, suburban moms, and we're seeing a shift because of the abortion issue, and I think the climate issue. I think the Democrats are on the ropes, but Democrats have opportunities now. It looks to me, from the vantage point of today, the Democrats will do all right in the Senate. Obviously, pending, we have several more months to go, and anything can happen. The House, I think we've seen some races tighten up, although there's not a lot of good polling in the House. But let's just say that the fortunes of the Democrats have gotten better. But the Democrats have one big serious flaw, and it's not the progressives versus the establishment, although that is a whole other issue. It goes back to the early 70s, a fellow named Ben Wattenberg, a moderate to even conservative Democrat, one of the key advisors to President Lyndon Johnson, wrote a book and said, Democratic Party is no longer a political party. It's a conglomeration of interest groups based on social issues that most people don't care about. Wow. And he was talking about it in the context of a party that had changed its rules and nominated George McGovern. And George McGovern was undone the day that he was nominated because of pressure that was coming from civil rights groups, women's rights groups, environmental groups, and so on. And kind of reached the kind of low point in 1984. Walter Mondale was a good man and a good candidate running against Ronald Reagan, but it was perceived that the Democratic Party was not even a party. To the point where, with all respect to Geraldine Ferraro, Mondale threw this Hail Mary pass and said, for the first time in history, I'm going to nominate a woman, because that's what women's groups were pushing for. But they nominated a 3-term congresswoman from Queens. I mean, hardly George H.W. Bush, whether you like the guy or not, but George H.W. Bush had the resume, right? So in any event, that lent credence to the notion, come on, this isn't even a party. This is whoever is yelling the loudest.
Wow.
So now what can undo Democrats is that, on one hand, recognizing that changes are taking place, especially in who we are and what we call ourselves. But is the Democratic Party just too woke
Wow.
for moderate voters? I mean, cisgender, pansexual, Latinx. These are terms that people don't use when they're walking to school or sitting in the workplace or at family dinner.
Yeah.
or whatever. Look, perhaps very legitimate. We are what we feel and say we are, but are Democrats and liberals thrusting this too fast, too soon on a population that isn't ready?
Wow. So, I mean, first of all, what was that guy's name again who wrote the book?
Oh, Ben Wattenberg. Well worth reading, even 50 years later.
So, I mean, he was already talking about what we're talking about in terms of identity politics.
Exactly.
And he saw that even then in the 60s, and now it's hyper. But, to go to your point, and just to build off of what you're saying, and this shouldn't be misconstrued into an attack against people who have these identities. The fact of the matter is, I think the libertarians are right. Keep your sexual stuff in the bedroom. Mm-hmm. Go outside in public and conduct yourself as people should in public. But what you believe in terms of your orientation, what your sexual preferences are, maybe that doesn't need to become the platform of a party. Because at the end of the day, that's really taking balkanization to a hyper level. You can understand that with multiple ethnicities in a region called the Balkans, with centuries and centuries of, feudal ties to their land or historic ties to their land, and cultural differences and religions meshing in there and whatever. But, like you said, this has arrived on the scene over the past 5 to 10 years, and it's sweeping like a tidal wave, trying to take over the entire conversation as this is what voters need to be focused on when inflation is ravaging. And people are now thinking about, well, am I going to be able to retire at 70?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a gotcha mentality. And the driving force is purity as I define it. Mm-hmm. And so liberal professors are victims. Bosses in the workplace are victims. Political candidates are victims. You have to be very, very careful, not only in public iterations, but everything is public. Mm-hmm. And it's a heavy reminder that both sides in their extremes, and I'm including conservative Republicans as well. Conservative Republicans may not speak in those terms, of wokeness, but they do speak in terms of who is the real conservative, who's a rhino, a Republican in name only. And when you go down that path of defining rigidity, and then there are rigidity is moving parts.
Yeah.
It's whatever it is I happen to call it today. Both parties are setting themselves up for failure, and who loses when that happens? Everybody. Okay, I've had it. What about you?
I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay, that's it.
That was it.
Have a good week.
You too.
All
Have a good weekend.
Thanks. You too.